The scientists that are in the Orion Project network have been identified over the last 15 years of our work in this area, and they range from people who have worked in classified projects, who have information about electrogravitic, anti-gravity, or over-unity electromagnetic systems, to people who have pretty much learned these areas on their own and have been experimenting, to folks who are engineers in electrical engineering and mechanical engineering, to academics that Dr. Loader and others in our network have identified, who know certain specialized areas that can be brought to bear to solve these problems. So it's a large network, and it's global. It's an international network. I think that one of the key points here is that we have identified the best people that can be identified who know this new area of energy research and science. And it's going to be out of this area that the solution to the environmental and energy crisis comes. It's not going to be from biofuels and wind and solar. It's going to be through research in the really new high-tech physics and sciences that deal with electromagnetic field, spin theory, electrogravitic, magnetogravitic systems as they've been described. And these are described on the orionproject.org website. But we've identified the best scientists that are living, who know these systems and understand these new sciences. The question is, how do you get them all coordinating and working in one place to actually come up with this robust demonstrator or robust system that's not, a few watts of power, but it's putting out kilowatts of power reliably, that runs, for years or decades, and that's strong enough to be able to then be placed in people's homes so that we can begin to replace the power grid and the coal-fired power plants with these new energy sources. That's a very significant R&D effort. And many people wonder why we don't have these by now, and I point out to them that, well, they have been developed in classified projects and kept secret, or there are individuals who've gotten pretty far with them, but then they've been intercepted. In fact, we have a member of our team who had worked at the patent office and had personally seen that there were several thousand patents that had been sequestered away and illegally classified that dealt with these sort of technologies because someone who has a vested interest in the conventional oil, gas, coal, energy sector didn't want the public to have them. It isn't about what is technically possible as much as it is what can be strategically protected and moved out. But there is a lot of technical work to be done. You can't do this without having a team that's properly funded and properly supported. And that's really why the Orion Project.org is a key new initiative that needs that. And our initial budget is around $3 million to provide just sort of seed funding for these inventors and engineers to get to this goal of a robust demonstrator. The scientists that are working with us are range from PhD academics to engineers to self-taught inventors, because unfortunately you can't really go to MIT or Caltech and learn these types of sciences. They've just simply not been allowed into the mainstream public domain. But there are people for 100 years, dating back to Tesla, who have come up with magnetic motors that tap into what's called a zero-point field of energy, or this electromagnetic flux field that becomes self-running and over unity, meaning they put out more energy than you have to put into them. Now, I want to comment here. A lot of people will say, well, that's not possible. Well, it is. A heat pump is around 4 times over unity. A heat pump that is running your house, electrical heating cooling system, is actually about 4 times more energy that it does in work than you have to put in electricity, except it goes into either heating or cooling. And so there are many ways that happens, and people take it for granted because it's so common. What we want to do is take these concepts and turn them into electric generating power plants so that they begin to replace the conventional fossil fuel plants, not only for homes and businesses, but also eventually industry and automobiles and cars, trucks. The suppression of these technologies has been very, very well organized for over 100 years. This can be proven. There are many accounts of people who have had their technologies, as I mentioned, forcibly confiscated or classified, illegally classified, by the abuses of Title 35, Section 180, 181 of the patent law. There are others who have been just flat out intimidated and threatened. Others simply bought out and told that, you know, you don't want to do this and we will buy it out from you. I think the most important way that it's been suppressed, this is a very good example, is that many times when support begins to build around one of these technologies, there is enormous pressure brought to bear to stop the funding of it or the support of it. For example, we were working with some people who had dealt with what are called charged clusters, and that Ken Shoulders and others had worked on. And the Department of Energy during the Clinton years, when Richardson was head of it, was going to authorize by a few $1 million, I don't remember the exact amount, to take that into a larger prototype system because it was capable of neutralizing radioactive waste. So we wouldn't need to be spending hundreds of billions of dollars on Yucca Mountain and what have you. And that funding was authorized at the level of the director of the Department of Energy. And then there was so much pressure brought to bear on him that they pulled that funding back even after they had announced or published that they were going to provide that grant. And that was based on research that had been reproduced by Japanese scientists and other universities. And so this kind of active interference in the natural progression of technologies that deal with over-unity effects is very well documented. It is not some kind of a theory. And so we feel that the only way to change that is to get millions of people involved and supporting this kind of technology, and also to have the developments announced in real time so that the public is participating. So it's not done secretively. It's not done in a way that would empower the interests that want to keep these things secret and suppressed, because too many people would know about it. And we have done this with other projects, of course, and it's been very successful. So I think we have to do that with the energy issues, because obviously the special interests, if you want to call them that have this $200 trillion piggy bank of oil and gas and coal and conventional power systems, have a lot of clout and have a way of stopping these things dead in their tracks, buying them out, intimidating. And unfortunately, I don't think the lone inventor sitting in his garage or even his laboratory is going to be able to go up against that. I think it's going to take a very well thought through strategic plan, which we have, and a lot of connections and support from people who do want to see these solutions, as well as the masses, the public, who are going to say, I'm going to support the funding of it, and then I'm going to support the disclosure and promulgation of these technologies, because now it's a matter of life and death for our planet, and also for our the peace of the planet. And I think people are getting that, because there's no way that we're going to have peace on Earth when there's the injustice of 80% of the world living in poverty and half the world's population living on less than $2 a day. That zero-sum game of the current economic order cannot be changed with fossil fuels. Because if 6.5 billion people lived like we did, with air conditioning and cars and all this, we would be out of fuel today. Never mind the effects on the biosphere and global warming and the polar ice caps and ice shelves melting. So we're going to have to come up with technologies that address that at a very fundamental level. It's technically absolutely doable, but it's going to require some funding, and it's going to require, I think, a lot of mass support from the public and people who are in institutions around the world who do want to see a solution to the environmental and energy crisis, who we have been identifying. The funding so far, I think, the most promising source is from the people. We have found that people who are very wealthy, or governments, as in the case of the Department of Energy, often have pressures placed on them not to support something that would be perceived as rocking the boat of the current status quo. And the current status quo, make no mistake about it, the machine that runs the entire world's industrial economy is fossil fuels of some type. Gas, natural gas, oil, coal, what have you. And you're not going to solve that problem by tinkering around the edges of it. You know, I mean, here's another inconvenient truth. Saving 10 or 20% isn't going to do much when you have billions of people in India and China going online with coal-fired power plants without any scrubbers. I mean, there's something like, over the next decade, 600 coal-fired power plants that are going online in India and China, which by themselves will double global greenhouse gases, even if all the rest of us stopped using our cars and our electricity. So there's simply no way to solve this problem using the conventional wisdom. And the solar and wind solutions, as wonderful as they are going to be too limiting to be effective enough quickly enough. We know through the study of these other technologies that you can create lots of electromagnetic power from this environmental energy that exists within what's called the zero-point energy field, or even within thermal gradients. And Dr. Lodo can speak to some of the research we're doing in that area. So the question is, can that be supported by the public adequately? If it is, I think that within a year or two, we would have some major breakthroughs in prototypes that could then be announced to the public, and then we could enlist the public support to get those out so that they could, and basically squeeze the toothpaste out of the tube quickly enough that it'd be very hard to put it back in. The question of retooling our industrial infrastructure is a very large one. I mean, really what we're talking about taking on here, and it should have happened 50 to 100 years ago, is a retooling of the entire operating system, if you want to look at it that way, of planet Earth. Because it's all now based on our addiction to oil and gas and coal and nuclear power. That transition isn't going to be done by waving a magic wand. It's not going to happen overnight. I think it can be done in 15 to 20 years, which in terms of rollover. But remember, in terms of having a technology from its inception to its widespread application, today is much faster than it was 20 or 30 or 40 years ago with communication and the internet and all of that. Look at cell phones, look at computers. I mean, all of these things have a way. So we think that, getting these systems developed can happen fairly quickly. We have people on our team who can arrange to have a manufacturing facility from scratch stood up within a year, that could be running on these new energy systems themselves, so they're non-polluting, that could then be cranking these systems out by the hundreds of thousands or millions. Of course there's going to have to be some really large funding support to move things into that level that quickly, but we know that can be done. But you first have to get to this robust demonstrator, and then there'll be the level of support to do that. I think the other thing to remember here, and this is something that we haven't touched on, is that, and it's implicit in this whole discussion, is that right now our entire way of living on the planet is a very heavy footprint. It's a huge burden on the Earth. And the reason for it is because of the type of energy systems we have. I remember as a high school student being with Archibald MacLeish, and he was saying at that time, in the 70s, early 70s, that the technologies already existed to scrub all of our smokestacks and manufacturing to zero effluent, zero pollution. But it took so much energy to do that, and energy itself created so much pollution, was so costly, that you got to this point of diminishing return very quickly. But what happens when you have free energy, literally, because the energy is coming from the environmental magnetic flux field, and it's non-polluting energy, there's no pollution associated with these systems, well then all the manufacturing can be zero impact in terms of clean. There can be 100% recycling, because recycling is an energy-intensive process. There can be desalination of water, which, I mean, there are pipelines for gasoline that run thousands of miles across continents, so even the desert shall bloom, you know, to quote a biblical concept. There's no shortage of water on the earth, there's a shortage of potable, fresh water, but the oceans are 2/3 covering the earth. And so the air itself has enormous moisture in it, and there are people that we're working with who've developed very efficient systems for squeezing moisture out of the air to create potable water or irrigation water, but those take electricity. So, but if your electrical needs are met from these systems, suddenly you can visualize a planet completely transformed and liberated from the shackles of the economic slavery of the current energy and manufacturing system that requires more than 2/3 of the world living in poverty. And I think that that is a big part of the vision of what the OrionProject.org wants to share with the public, is that this isn't a pipe dream. This can absolutely be done. The critical thing that's been missing for decades is a big breakthrough. That's why I call it a breakthrough campaign that we're trying to do in the basic energy generation arena. And that's cost effective, and that puts out large amounts of energy and power that can be used for these purposes.